Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You are now in the session on the Center of Excellence. And as a result, we have some excellent people to talk about it. So as we begin to settle in, so in the effort to keep us to some semblance of time, my name is Roger Pulwarty. I work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the U.S. government. And I deal with things like weather, water, and climate extremes. As we think through this event and as we begin to characterize what do we need to know and what do we need to do, and why do we need a center of excellence that links activities from disaster risk reduction to climate change adaptation, as the SRSG has said many times, we cannot do climate adaptation without effective DRR, and we need to get our heads around that. But to get our heads around that means not simply going back to issues of collaboration, coordination, and the use of science and practice, but to build a mechanism that gets us there, to turn words into action, and more importantly, words into the right action. And we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those right actions are. So this is the newly created Center of Excellence for Climate and Disaster Resilience between the WMO and the UNDRR. I've been fortunate to help both of those organizations in different ways. I co-chair the Climate Services Information System for the WMO and work with the UNDRR on various GARs. So we're beginning to unwrap the roadmap to the center, the things that might be planned for giving the center a thread, as the Germans call it, the Roter Fader, through Sendai, Paris, and ultimately the 2030 agenda. But we're taking the fact that we need to get to 2030, and we're not accelerating the scale and rate at which we're doing things and coordinating as effectively as we can. And this is one of the purposes of the center, to really begin to accelerate the things that are needed to meet 2030 and beyond, but to do that among the most vulnerable, the most fragile, and to bring to bear the global networks and knowledge that we have in the scientific information system, but also the knowledge of local people. I'm originally from the Caribbean. I work on islands and other things like that, but we know we exist within a globally networked world. So I'll start here by introducing the people who I have with me on stage. And we have an order of business, speaker number one, and then there's, as you know, prior to the introduction, I'm going to ask Mr. Johan Stander and Ricardo Mena from WMO and UNDR respectively to give us a few minutes of guidance on where we're going here, a little bit of opening remarks. First, immediately after that, we'll have Mr. Saber Hussain Chowdhury, Chair of the Parliamentary Standing Committee of the Ministry of the Environment and the Government of Bangladesh. Mr. Ganot Laganda, Chief of the Disaster Risk Reduction Program of the WFP. You know. Ms. Moana Kiowa, Deputy Director of the National Disaster Management Organization in Tonga. And then Ms. Tiziana Bonzon, Manager of Climate Migration and Resilience for the IFRC, people who are well known to the community. So before we begin, I'm going to ask for a few comments from WMO on the founding agencies of the Center of Excellence, from Mr. Johan Stander, and then from Ricardo Mena of the UNDR. So Johan, please. And welcome, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to say a couple of words on behalf of the WMO and UNDRR. We see ourselves now actually as family. UNDRR moved into our building, and with the Center of Excellence, we're actually now just putting the glue together, which bonds us a little bit closer to one another, and it's really brilliant to work with them. Climate change will affect all aspects of human life and the natural world, leading to increasing losses and damages. Livelihoods, lives and social economic stability of regions and countries already at risk, along with natural environment on which we all depend. Thus, under current and future climate change, the increase in number and frequency of extreme events will lead to higher disaster risks associated with more losses and damages which are pasting at the moment countries' capacity to prevent, prepare for and respond and build resilience to crisis. Weather and climate extremes are occurring more frequently, and along with other incidents such as COVID-19, conflicts may result in transversal and cascading crises, which are driving up humanitarian needs to an unprecedented levels. A paradigm shift is urgently needed. We must dramatically scale up ex-ante approaches on prevention and preparedness across systems and sectors, such as adaptive social protection, if we are to stem the consequences of these growing threats and increase the resilience. We must work towards a better understanding of risk and its drivers while also working to avoid the creation of new risks. And indeed, while climate-related hazards, disaster risk and the implications are intertwined, and the system to anticipate, prepare for, prevent, and manage them are not there yet. The current landscape across the spectrum from prevention to preparedness and emergency responses is fragmented, with a multidisciplinary of disconnection between stakeholders from the weather, climate, development, humanitarian, disaster risk management, social protection, and environmental sectors. Each is tackling a part of the issue, but are often working not in parallel, duplicating efforts, or leaving gaps between them. This disjointed nature hampers effectiveness and limits the overall impact of those efforts. In addition, while agencies may work bilaterally on specific issues and problems, overall stakeholders in this space lack a joined-up seamless flow from science and data to policy and practice. Furthermore, data to understand increasingly volatile climate patterns as well as risks in frequency inaccessible in countries hit hardest by climate crises and climate change. While whether these countries have access to new technology for more accurate prediction, multi-hazard early warning systems still don't exist in roughly half of the world, and we have a serious challenge here to address this in the next 5 years. With this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let us keep in mind we need to look at the seamless approach across all timescales through this value cycle. Now, to put all of this in perspective, one of the foundations to get this going and to respond to these issues, the World Meteorological Organization, as mentioned by the moderator and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, launched a Center of Excellence for Disaster and Climate Resilience on the 2021 International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. In the Center of Excellence, WMO and UNDRR will work together with partner agencies to strengthen efforts to transform scientific knowledge and tools into action, supporting climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. In parallel to the launch, joint initiatives or invitations were sent to partners, agencies to share their expressions of interest and the initial perspectives on the added value brought by the Center of Excellence. As a result, almost a dozen responded positively, and I'm going to name them in alphabetic order. The Food and Agricultural Organization, the Group on Earth Observations, International Federation for Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, International Science Council, UN Development Program, UN Environmental Program, UN Institute for Training and Research, UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or better known as UNESCO, the World Bank and the World Food Programme. Their representatives participated in the first steering committee meeting chaired by our Secretary General, Professor Petri Talas of the World Meteorological Organization, and Ms. Mami Mizitori, the UN Secretary General's Special Representative to Disaster Risk Reduction, in December 2021, and again we had a follow-up meeting in March 2022. Altogether, the partners agreed on 3 guiding principles for the Centre of Excellence. Principle 1, working in collaborative and integrative way. At the heart of the Centre of Excellence, in a recognition that collectively agencies working across the spectrum from disaster prevention to preparedness and greater than the sum of its individual contributions. Ultimately, the COE aims to leverage the perspective portfolios of its members to create a full package of tools from data to science to policy and practice that are required. Principle 2, addressing the drivers or risk and reaching the last mile, which you've heard so often the last couple of days coming from Monday. The Centre of Excellence aims to ensure that all its work is useful and applicable to those working on the front lines of the climate emergency and disaster risks. Its deliverables will orientate towards useful, robust and actionable applications for decision makers on the ground. And then the last but not least, Principle 3, prioritizing high vulnerable and fragile contexts. The Centre of Excellence will focus its initiatives on these settings where risks is heightened, but interventions are either limited, inefficient, or unusable, and subsequently insufficient to meet the growing need. The Centre of Excellence, therefore, aligns with the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind, as well as the previous global platform which emphasized leave no place, no ecosystem behind. Since then, further collaborative work has been done and developed the action plan going forward. And our colleague Ricardo is going to elaborate further on those things already developed. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Splendid, splendid. Thank you so very much, Johan. It has given us the frame and the guidance for the need to craft a virtuous circle among science, policy, and practice, and the data and information that can support that, and the need to accelerate that within the particular context that he mentioned. So next up, I'm going to ask my friend and colleague, Ricardo Mena, to give us another lead-in into why we're here.
Thank you, Roger, very much, and friends, panelists, and all those who are present. Great to see you here. And we are indeed extremely excited about the Center of Excellence since this idea came to us together with WMO. We have been working on it, and we have received a lot of very positive feedback already, and we can see that this is generating a lot of exciting and of course raising the expectations on what we are going to do. So actually, I had here on my talking points lots of things talking about the situation in which we are, increasing risk, increasing number of disasters, increased need on humanitarian assistance, but I'm not going to refer to it. I don't need to preach the converted. We know the situation in which we are, and that's precisely why we have created a Center of Excellence. But let me just say that Roger was mentioning, no, sorry, it wasn't Roger, it was Johan saying that.
If it's insightful, it's Johan. If it's not, it's me.
Okay, thanks. But Johan was saying about how we, WMO and UNDRR, are working together and bonding our two institutions to have a greater impact. And what the Center of Excellence does actually, because it's not just UNDRR and WMO, it's a number of agencies within the United Nations and outside the United Nations that we are trying to bond together so that we can punch much stronger than what we can individually do. So this is the I would say the principle, one of the principles of the Center of Excellence. And we want the Center of Excellence to be a true amplifier, and not only on the messaging, but also on the substance that it can bring. We want it to be an accelerator, because we do indeed need to accelerate action. Otherwise, we are going to be far from meeting the outcome, goal, and priorities of action of the Sendai framework and the SDGs as well. And we want it to be a connector, and it's not going to be a closed club. It's going to be on the opposite, a very open and inclusive initiative. And as a matter of fact, it's not only the members of the Center of Excellence that we have been working with very closely, it's actually all the other networks and organizations that are going, more or less on the same direction, working already on many of the issues that relate to climate and disaster resilience, such as, for example, the REAP and INSU resilience and others. So we are closely connecting and opening up discussion and consultations so that we avoid duplication. This is something that has been definitely put with an underline and in bold. We don't want to duplicate what already exists. What we want to do is we want to use the capacities of the different agencies and organizations to build together something that goes beyond what already exists, with the intention of actually, as I said at the beginning, punch much beyond our own weight. So this is what we expect the center to become. And of course, we have had already a couple of meetings of the steering committee of the center. We have established also a technical advisory group of members of the same organizations that are part of the Center of Excellence. And we have been working for these past months in a very open and consultative process to try to come up with an action plan. Because at the end of the day, what we need is to deliver, and we need to deliver something that has great impact. So the initial draft, let's say, of the action plan has been developed, and Lori and Cyril have been working hard and connecting with all the organizations that are part of the Center of Excellence and others, as I said, to come up with a feasible, ambitious, impactful first action plan. That's what we are going to be working on the next couple of months. And I'm going to refer very quickly to some of the things that are coming up. But as I said, this is still work in progress. But of course, in some cases, we need to define quickly what we want to do, because we want to ensure that we have quick, impactful deliverables. And especially looking at the COP27, which is just around the corner, we do want to have some outputs that can contribute to the discussions at the COP. So, a few things we are trying to do, and of course we have agreed that the activities of the center will be focusing around 3 key areas of work, and they relate to improving risk understanding through greater collaboration on data and analysis, strengthening risk governance, including at the local level, and financing and improved early warning. With the announcement of the Secretary General just a few weeks ago, with his ambition to make sure that by the next 5 years everybody is covered by early warning systems, there is a need for greater acceleration on this one. And in terms of the plan of action, I'm going to read just quickly some of the, so what I was trying to say is that we have come up, and I'm going to quickly go through some of these actions. So we want, for example, to develop case studies on how DRR and CCA is being implemented, and with a specific focus on highly vulnerable and fragile countries, so that we can have it in time for the COP. Something else we want to do, as you know, this year, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is going to be focusing on Target G of the Sendai framework. If anybody does not remember what Target G is, it's availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems, risk information and risk assessment. So we want to produce a report on what's the status of Target G implementation, using again the broad base of information that collectively all the agencies and organizations that are part of the center have. And we want to also develop solution packages, as we call them. And these solution packages are basically pieces for decision makers that can help them synthesize the research and good practices and provide them with the range of risk management options that they have available so that they can take them into account for decision-making purposes. Other things we want to do is we want to target leadership and within the UN system, but also with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and the NGOs that have need for greater capacity building to enable them to better understand comprehensive risk management and why it is so fundamental for all development and humanitarian programming. And there is, of course, the necessary link with the financing institutions to make the case for greater investment in these challenging settings, including analysis of the benefits of community-led DRR action. And this is something that, we have all the organizations working on this have emphasized on the need to work on that as well. So this is just, a brief reference from my side. As I said, this is still work in progress, and we pretty much look forward to listening to the audience today to see what else, what are we missing, and what else can we do to include in this action plan. So, as I said, Center is a very collaborative effort with each of these work streams led by a specific member agency. Every agency, based on their expertise and their knowledge and data availability, those that are best placed are going to be leading each one of the areas that I just mentioned. And so I would also, as Johan, thank all the agencies and organizations that are part of the Center of Excellence. We, of course, are looking forward to others joining this initiative. We already have expressions of interest of other organizations. And as I said, this is pretty much an inclusive effort. So I also look forward to listen to what our experts have to say on the panel. And with this, I end, not before thanking you also for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And in that setting, as we heard from both of our speakers, and fully appreciate Ricardo's point about listening. I go to a lot of hearings, they're not listening. And one of the things as we begin to think through that is the issue of case studies and learning from others and the availability of data and information. As we begin to think through the speakers that we have, we're asking them to help us listen, to help us understand what the dimensions, the barriers are to getting at a better coordinated approach to the things that we're doing in the way that Ricardo and Johan just laid out. There's a whole aspect here that in spite of all of those slower processes, as Ricardo pointed out, we need to be decisive. And we need to be deciding the right things. And that's a bigger challenge. We can decide a lot on the wrong things very quickly. So as we think through this, I'd like to move through and the efforts that you heard from Johan and from Ricardo on the need for engaging partners within the governance, the engagement of others into the center, and showing how their actions might be leveraged and supported by the center activities. So we'll go, there's a Slido, and the meeting link is, I don't know if we have it up somewhere, Adam, 044-7294, there we go, to ask any questions of the panelists. And the order of business is that we will ask the speakers to give us a key response to a question that we have that takes about 5 minutes. And I'd like to move through the list of panelists that we have and then get comments from the audience on some of the member agencies within the center, and then come back to the broader set of questions that the audience might have on engagement and strategies. So as you can tell, we're taking this very seriously in the context of the comments you just heard, that the idea of acceleration, of integration, of catalyzing is critical. But none of that operates without key people working in the system and the nodes for governance. And so we're going to get our first speaker here, Sabar Chaudhry, as I introduced him, and I'm going to ask you a question, Mr. Chaudhry, as we think through all of our activities from the Special Report on Extremes to the GAR. A fundamental question for the new center, which I'd like you to address in the context of your own experiences. Bangladesh has seen great success in improving DRR, But climate change is posing new challenges, sometimes undermining the efforts of traditional risk management. What are some of the gaps that you still see, and how, in your experience, have we tried to overcome some of those gaps of linking these different timescales and responses and cross-agency coordination that's needed? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, and a very good morning to everyone, and greetings from Bangladesh. I was listening very intently, especially to Ricardo, what you were saying, and one of the words you mentioned was duplication. You want to avoid duplication. So if I look at it in context of Bangladesh, we have had incredible success when it comes to disaster response, when it comes to reducing mortality. So another area that we are actively looking at the moment is how can we have more efficient use of the limited resources that we have. I think that's from the point of view of the recipient of potential assistance from the center, that's critically important. How do I get the biggest bang out of my dollar? And we did an exercise in Bangladesh a while back where we tried to see what is the commonality between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So if you draw two circles, the overlap is almost 83%, and it's actually growing. So it's the same constituency, two different ministries, a number of different agencies. So it's duplication, it's fragmentation of resources, not the most efficient way to go about things. And we have tried a few concepts. I'll give you two examples. So if you can visualize a map of South Asia, you have got the Nepal and the Himalayas sitting on top. And under that, you have got Bangladesh and also, of course, parts of India. So because of increasing rise in temperatures, you have glacial melt. So the waters from the Himalayas are flowing through the Bay of Bengal or flowing through the rivers of Bangladesh into the Bay of Bengal. So because the rivers don't have the capacity to cater to that amount of flood water, quite often you have flooding. And through flooding, it has an impact on food production and everything else. So the project that Bangladesh has taken, and we are trying to use this as a showcase project, is do dredging to increase the depth of the river so that you're actually able to carry more water, your capacity increases. You use the dredge material to build embankments on either side of the river, and then you have plantation on the embankments. So that, to me, is a response. It's climate change adaptation and also disaster risk reduction that you're doing at the same time. Another example, salinity intrusion because of climate change is now a big issue. So how do you still maintain the integrity of your food security system? How do you maintain your production levels? And so what we have done is we have designed, or we have innovated, whatever term you wish to use, saline-resistant crops. So these are going to grow even in saline waters. That, again, is another example of adapting to climate change and trying to mitigate the risk of future disasters. So I think for us, it makes a lot of sense. Where we probably need more assistance is how do we rationalize this convergence and institutionalize this convergence between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Because we have two ministries, so there is already fragmentation there. And one of the ways that we can potentially look at it, I think, and this is where we would probably look for support to justify, is to have a single budget for comprehensive risk management. Our budgeting is done on the basis of ministries. So ministries are allocated resources. So if we can actually have one budget allocation, one budget line that integrates both aspects of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, then I think it's a huge win-win for all concerned. I'm trying to find, we all say we need convergence, so we often answer the question what, and we don't go into how it is to be done. How do we do what needs to be done? And so this is one example. The other critical ministry here would be the Ministry of Planning, because they are the ones who formulate the plan. And the other agency that I would loop in would be the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, because that is the official source of data. We may produce very credible, very nicely presented tons of data, but unless it is recognized by the National Bureau of Statistics, it doesn't get acknowledged by the government. So I think that would be another area that we can potentially look at. Otherwise, in terms of everything else that has been said, I know these have been said many times, but when you're trying to have effective governance and manage risk, you really have to understand the risk, especially now that the nature of risk is also very dynamic. We know, of course, that it's embedded in the development process, but where? Is it in governance? It is in environmental degradation? Is it because of inequality? So trying to pinpoint the areas is very important, because unless you do that, you can't really have the interventions that are necessary. So I think that's another area. How do we have risk that is cascading, of course, within our boundaries and also externally? We have seen how COVID started off as a health emergency and quickly then transformed into a global social and economic disaster. So we also have these in a smaller scale in a country like Bangladesh. So I think trying to understand that entire dynamic, trying to pinpoint, trying to back up our policy with data and statistics and analysis. It's not just data, it's actually analysis. I mean, what are the policy options that we can consider from a set of driven data? So I think capacity building would also be important, because this is something that, we don't want to be reliant on the center of excellence forever. We want to have our own centers of excellence in Bangladesh and in other countries. So how do you actually build that capacity? I think that would also be important. How much time do I have, Roger?
That was it.
Oh, that's it?
Yes.
Okay.
But we will come back based on the questions and so on. I will certainly do it.
Sorry, there wasn't a timer here. So, it says time's up.
Yeah,
My mistake.
so they meant all of us.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So time's up for action is what they sort of, anyway. So the idea, we'll come back to some of the key points being made, but I really think your questions about capacity and enabling across silos, easy to point to, but how we actually get across them is rich. So let's think through. Thank you very much for the comments. And so now I'll ask a question of Gano. So as we begin to think through this, we know that climate change and disaster risk are contributing to food insecurity globally and intensifying humanitarian needs. What role do you see for a body such as the Center of Excellence, or any center in the way Mr. Chowdhury has outlined within a country, helping to organize and think through these issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. Thanks for coming to this important session. It's, for me, I think a great privilege to come after Mr. Chowdhury, because he really set the stage very well. I mean, ultimately we're here because we're all concerned about fragmentation, right? So our international aid architecture is fragmented in a humanitarian sphere, a development sphere, a climate sphere, a peace sphere. But when you go out into the field, you talk with food insecure communities, you realize it's all about vulnerability, and this is a very artificial way of looking at the world. Unfortunately, when we want to help reduce vulnerability, that segmentation comes with different sources of finance, it comes with different timescales, it comes into different sectors. So there is a constant pull towards fragmentation in our aid system, and we all try to overcome it in a way. The problem we have is that we do not have a lot of time. So fragmentation in a period where we are already seeing losses and damages that are brought about by the climate crisis, fragmentation is a luxury. Piloting is a luxury. We have about a decade's time to really combine and sequence different sources of finance in order to address these rampant vulnerabilities. And coming from the humanitarian sector, we are especially concerned because we see a runaway trend of hunger in the world. At the moment, the number of people who suffer from acute food insecurity is doubling every 2 years. In 2019, we had around 135 million people in acute food crisis or emergencies. Now we are looking at double that number. So it's only 2 years later as a result of these compound problems of climate shocks, conflicts, COVID-19, and there's a fourth C here, costs, inflation, after also the war in Ukraine, we see a runaway problem. And so it's urgent, right? The humanitarian system cannot save the day here. We're confronted with a financing gap of around 50% in all our programs. So basically, only half the number of people who require food assistance can be supported. And so we are very concerned that if we do not invest in building systems, in enabling systems that reduce fragmentation, then in about a decade from now, when we're in tipping point territory of the climate crisis, basically the international aid system, the government systems are not going to be able to deal with that runaway trend. So this is why we're part of the Center of Excellence. We bring a little bit that perspective of fragility. We see fragility as a trend that is increasing. We have 39 countries in the world today where we have life-threatening status of food insecurity, which is very worrying. I mean, once you have food system breakdowns, then you have also fragility, displacements, conflicts, so that fragility is here to stay, it's here to grow. And we need to learn how to effectively undertake resilience building, climate action in fragile contexts as well. And this is, I think, one piece we want to address under the Center of Excellence. There is a study from UNDP from March this year that says about $162 per person per year in climate finance are available to non-fragile countries, while very fragile countries have only $2 per person per year. So we're talking about 80 times the difference. It's like we relegate countries that have already started to unravel at this intersection between climate conflict and economic disruptions to the humanitarian space, where then people need to be supported, while the climate finance and the resilience finance is clustering in the more investable settings, so to speak. So we need to find ways to also undertake climate action, resilience building in fragile economies. And in the Center of Excellence, we're trying to find out how we can do that. We're trying to do case studies on how this is already happening, how community-based disaster risk reduction can be as effective as national level systems building. And then lastly, there is also a question that we all are asking ourselves on the costs and benefits of resilience building. Probably if you are going through these sessions in the GPDRR, you hear these different ratios. $1 invested in prevention saves, $4, $7, $13 in response. But ultimately, I think this is very context specific, and every government and every agency that's part of the Center of Excellence needs to understand where do these numbers come from, to which types of contexts and programs do they apply, because this is then also what governments need in order to make informed decisions. So overall, I think we are very happy that the Center of Excellence provides us with a platform to engage and bridge the humanitarian, the development, the climate communities. And I'm looking forward to work with like-minded people on these issues that are, in our opinion, critical to fighting hunger in the world. Thank you.
Great. Very much. Thank you so much, Gernot. We'll come back towards the end of the session on the critical issue raised by Gernot, and that is how we learn from each other and how we help facilitate that. But he's reminding us the bottom line, as Einstein said, is not about our models, our data, and our information. That is critical. In the end, it is about reducing people's vulnerability. So as we begin to think through some of this, I'm going to introduce a fellow islander, Moana Keoa, Deputy Director of the National Disaster Management Organization in Tonga, and ask the question, Moana, Tonga is a country on the front line of the climate crisis, and you face risks such as other aspects of hazards, eruption of volcanoes, tsunamis earlier this year. What challenges do you have and how might we overcome them in reaching the last mile where we have such a multiplicity of hazards and a need for early warning? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Despite the logistical challenges to get here to attend this meeting, we are excited to be part of this big thing, this global meeting, to perhaps take home some good learnings. For those of you who may not aware where Tonga is, we are near New Zealand and Fiji, with a population of a little over 100,000 people, with a couple of handful of diaspora living overseas. We gave the world a bit of a shake on the 15th of January this year with the most recent volcanic eruption and also the tsunami. Our death toll was only 4, and I guess the whole world is eyeing why was it only 4. To come back to the question, we all know that Tonga was cut off from the external world when the tsunami on the 15th Jan broke our underground communication cable. While the cable to connect Tonga internationally have been repaired back, still we are yet to repair the underground cable which connects main island of Tongatapu and the other outer islands. It has reminded us the whole of the reason and the world, the vulnerability of our communication system relying on underground sea cable. The early warning system always depends on reliability of means of communication, its timeliness and effectiveness. In this sense, it is always a challenge for us to establish an early warning system which can warn people with enough time for preparedness and evacuation when need be. Even in normal time, our mobile network and connection is always problematic within the outer islands. Vulnerability of our cable system is not only for Tonga, but perhaps within our region. Our connection to the external world is through the undersea cable, which was damaged by the eruption and the tsunami. Thankfully, we have established some communication to the external world, but we are yet to repair our internal cable system, which took us 8 to 9 months to get that repaired. If we can imagine if something happened today or tomorrow in Tonga, we have no means of warning the people because that is still questionable and there are still works to be done. So while me and my 2 other colleagues who are attending and enjoying the luxury of infrastructure here in Bali, we also concerned of our people back home. Geographical remoteness of the outer islands, although there may be not much return on investments, but it's the life of the human is important and it needs to install proper, inclusive communication system in smaller and remoter islands. Provided our being smallness, often our issues back home can be overlooked in big meetings like this. But we still have our fair share of the natural intakes that we have. I hear yesterday and the other day that Bali is the 7-Eleven or the, what you call, that chokes. Tonga is still number 2 in the whole world for the most vulnerable island country in the whole world. So having said that, I'm sitting here in front, but I feel so small because in the past days, no one get to share or even utter our words with the most recent eruption that shake the whole world on the 15th of January. So I ask please to hear us out, and we need robust early warning system to be installed in our small islands. As we're coming more and more relying on the technology, there's need to also boost traditional knowledge, which can be blended with the modern traditional technology with clear messages is always a challenge. COVID pandemic, Tonga was COVID-free for the past 2.5 years until we had the eruption. That's when, because we were receiving a lot of aid, boats, planes, that's when we got COVID. Luckily, it was the weaker version that we get. Otherwise, I won't be here today. So without proper communication, early warning system will be challenged. So these are our real issues in Tonga. We have to see how we can overcome it. To wrap up, I think we still need integration, and integration that perhaps we need to customize and contextualize that makes it work for us, for such a country, small island like Tonga, and perhaps our island neighbors in the Pacific region. Longer-term engagement and further collaboration between agencies, stakeholders, and governments is very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moana, for reminding us that islands are indeed the integrators of many hazards. as we think through that and we think about the issue of communication and distance. Next up, we have Tiziana Monson, and I'm going to ask Tiziana, who is from the Climate Migration and Resilience Group of IFRC, to answer the question, or address the question, how can we work better together to build the capacities to avert, minimize, and address issues of loss and damages and the capabilities that might be needed to address some of the things that we've heard. Great, thank you, Tiziana.
Thank you so much. And allow me maybe to articulate my interventions along the areas where we believe the more capacities and resources are actually needed, especially from a humanitarian perspective. As a humanitarian organization, we know that the humanitarian community cannot manage alone the humanitarian impacts of the climate crisis. Actually, we are already stretched. And as we heard from all the other panelists, there's no doubt that we need to continue to invest in adaptation, in disaster risk reduction. This is crucial. But we have to pay particular attention to the countries and the communities that are often left behind, either because it is difficult to invest or politically sensitive to invest. The adverse impacts of climate and weather-related disasters that generate losses and damages, often also leading to displacement, can be avoided in some contexts, but certainly mitigated in many other contexts through effective disaster risk reduction measure, investing in locally led adaptation and resilience, and scaling up early warning systems. But that said, even if these efforts were properly resourced, and often we know that they are not, there still can be residual effects from observed impacts and projected risks, which the climate community referred to as loss and damage. But these concepts, in fact, very much overlap with adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and as a matter of fact, they are not so new for humanitarians. We've actually long been supporting people exactly confronted with climate-related losses and damages because of inadequate risk reduction investments, but also because the risks, as we all know, are rising. So what to do? We therefore need to increase investments, public and private investments, we're not saying it enough, in disaster risk prevention and reduction, strengthening preparedness, including early warning systems, contingency planning, evacuation planning, resilience building strategies and plans, but also scaling up anticipatory action, including through innovative approaches, such as forecast-based financing. Responses to loss and damage require, in fact, a strong integrated package of actions determined by the communities who are most exposed to the climate risk, that are the most vulnerable and with least capacities to cope. We need social protection, insurance pools, solidarity funds, as well as investing in what we would define the building blocks of anticipatory action. Maybe let me just expand a little bit on this point. We know that for successful implementation of anticipatory action, we need to have local community preparedness and resilience capacities as the foundation. We have seen time and again that anticipatory action can work where we have strong community early warning systems, contingency response plans in place, and from the very beginning, the engagement from the communities. Allow me to take the example of Bangladesh. The Bangladesh Cyclone Preparedness Program is an excellent example where we have leveraged years of experiences in preparedness and resilience to develop early action plans. Currently, one of our members, the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society, has already 3 action plans for cyclones, floods, heat wave, with pre-identified triggers and attached financing mechanisms to exactly avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. Another critical factor is for effective and sustainable anticipatory action is to adopt a collective design of anticipatory action plans that really need to be grounded in national disaster risk management and climate change plans, strategies, and policies. And such work would therefore enable a concerted efforts in order to overcome sectoral silos and increasing the ownership of anticipatory actions approaches in country. Again, another example, in the Philippines, the Philippine Red Cross Society works together with the National Disaster Management Agency, Hydromet Service, local governments, and external agencies to be able to shift from being disaster response focused and actually incorporating pre-disaster timelines to enable anticipatory action as part of the disaster response. Another area is disaster and policy, which is an avenue that we need to explore more to facilitate approaches that are necessary to addressing losses and damage. and tackle things such as climate displacement and planned relocation. So just to end, locally led adaptation that is respectful of local realities and capacities remains, of course, central to responding to losses and damages and for effective adaptation and along the loss and damage continuum. It is essential as well to bring the local perspectives and experience to inform countries that are now carrying out loss and damage needs assessment. We know that these loss and damage needs assessments are not yet common practice everywhere. We are lacking clear methodology, maybe a platform that is able to, where we can feed this information into, possibly two elements of what the Santiago Network may be looking into. But we can imagine that this type of assessment will actually become more frequent. So we need to engage more. Finally, we need to strengthen coherence between climate change adaptation, DRR, and sustainable development. And I believe that the center will be an obvious space where we can continue to raise awareness and build capacities also on this topic. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tiziana. Very insightful. So as we heard from the speakers, especially including the last two, local is critical, but so are the networks in which the local operates. And you heard that clearly from Moana about the issue of the cable and the time it takes to do that, and we experience very similar things elsewhere. So the center will help ask and answer what is needed at each scale and how do we get to it as well, and how they're connected. So from that standpoint, I would definitely like to thank the panelists, and we'll come back to a final question before we wrap up. But right now, I think I'd like to engage some of the comments from the floor before we go to questions from the audience. And I'd like to start with Rui Kotani from the Geo Secretariat. And the whole idea, there's a Slido, right? So I'd like to, hold on. Okay, wait. We got to follow the agenda, all right? So what I'd like to do is get some interventions from the floor of the partners in GEO and then come back to the questions from the audience across all of them. Because we're hearing cases, but we also need to understand who's behind this and who's helping us coordinate it before we get questions from the audience. So thanks very much. I understand and appreciate the interest in getting engaged in this. So first up, is Rui in the room? Do we have you here from the Group on Earth Observations? Am I missing you? The light is right here, Rui, and I couldn't see you. I was running away from my friend Wadid, who was trying to distract me. So I think you can do it from there. Yeah, if you want to stand up, please, Rui. I actually can't see you in that corner.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. My name is Rui. Thank you for introducing me. I'm a DR coordinator at the GEO Secretariat. So GEO is delighted and also honored to be a core partner of the Center of Excellence since the very beginning. Thank you for the invitation. GEO is, for those of you who doesn't know, is an IGO and international partnership. Very much striving to turn Earth observations data and information into knowledge for action, including disaster risk reduction. And we've been working very closely with the UNDR for several years, for example, on GAR, which was just launched, and the Global Risk Assessment Framework graph. And as Ricardo mentioned, one of the COE's aim is to be an accelerator. And Yana Jagovian, director of the GEO Secretariat, who is honored to be serving as a steering committee member of COE, proposed this idea for that the COE has adopted, which Ricardo mentioned, that the COE becomes an accelerator, a space to test ready-to-go, fit-for-purpose products for use at the national and subnational level and to reach the last mile. So towards this goal, GEO has committed to participate in 2 working groups on risk data and analysis and the solution packages. And GEO, in collaboration with DR and ESRI, just launched yesterday Earth Observations Risk Toolkit here at GP and presented on the Ignite the stage. And so this toolkit provides direct links to openly available Earth observation solutions which consists of tools, services, and methodologies with accompanying use cases based on solid Earth observations data. These show how decision makers can have used EO solutions to reduce risk and damage and leverage disaster risk financing to the most vulnerable people who really need support, as Mr. Laganda just mentioned, and to improve Sendai reporting. So EO Risk Toolkit is designed to be an integral part of the REX under GRAPH, and we're very much looking forward to working with partners in Center of Excellence and various partners, and including national partners such as Planning Ministry, the Stat Bureau that Mr. Chowdhury mentioned. We really hope to leverage these solutions in the solution package in the new toolkit, so that the Center of Excellence can make risk data analysis and solutions more accessible to countries and bring them to scale. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rui. Yes, apparently shedding light on things isn't all it's cracked up to be. I work closely with Rui and Jana. I sit on the disaster research team and the climate, and they've been at the forefront of thinking about the observations in that context. So next up, we have from the International Science Council, Anne-Sophie Savance, another partner in the design and implementation of the Center of Excellence.
Thank you very much. So from the International Science Council side, we think the creation of the Center of Excellence is very timely to bring knowledge to bear across a wide range of risks. So as a scientific partner of the center, we want to contribute an integrated approach to risk, bringing together knowledge from across disciplines, from across sector, to address the wide range of risk we're looking at. And we all know integration is hard, so we're working actively on a number of components of that integration around data interoperability in terms of terminology and definition, bringing a common language, bringing together interdisciplinary expertise, and that needs a lot of design, a lot of facilitation, and bringing more to the forefront the social sciences. We've heard a lot about the importance of governance, of institutions, of values, of behaviors during the conference, and that's something we're very keen to contribute also to the center. In terms of what we want to see is perhaps a stronger focus on implementation, application. We need to get to the how question. What works, what doesn't, in what context and why. And that has bearing as to how the center is going to operate and with whom it's going to work. So this is not just about accumulating knowledge, it's going to be about really translating that knowledge, about bringing conversations, about supporting experimentation. And we're very excited to contribute to that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Anne-Sophie. I think Ron Jackson from UNDP is not here, one of my compatriots from the region. And what I'd like to move to next is Zita Sebeshvari from the UN University for some comments. There you go, Zita. Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. So UNU, United Nations University, is the academic arm of the United Nations, and our mandate is actually to serve the UN system with scientific knowledge and evidence-based decision options. And what we often see that science comes in oftentimes before action happening, kind of advising what could be done, or later assessing what have been done and what went wrong. And what is less often funded actually to accompany action with science and work together. And this is one of the motivation for us to be in this Center of Excellence, to work together towards solution. And so UNU is steering the group looking into solution packages. And what you mean with packages is that we talk about this fragmentation, that everyone is implementing different type of solutions and we need to integrate them, but the question is how. So if you are thinking about adaptive social protection, nature-based solution, insurance, early warning, in my opinion, in most cases, you need all these different kind of solutions, but the way of integration, how to put them together into to sell it as a package, so to say, and to address the issues at hand that is less obvious, so to say. So the aim is to work against fragmentation. Maybe just one note to Tonga, because UNU is having a flagship report called Interconnected Disaster Risk. And in the upcoming launch event in September, one of the cases we are looking into is Tonga, looking into the root causes and potential solutions. So I'm happy that I can immediately follow your call for more attention for Tonga.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, and our last intervention from a partner is Marco Erico from FAO. I will remind everyone, your questions have to go through the Slido so we can moderate them, otherwise we'll have too many of them. So, and do we have, if you don't mind, Adam, can we put that Slido number back up again so we remind people? Great, thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity. My name is Marco Erico from FAO. We definitely welcome this center of excellence. We think that by putting together the UN organization, international financing institution, private sector, academia, and science, we can really make a difference in achieving our objectives, especially of the overarching 2030 agenda. FAO can bring a lot of experience from the field on technical expertise. I'm particularly thinking of all the work we have been doing on resilience measurement, our resilience units in regional offices, and we definitely are willing to contribute supporting enhancing understanding of resilience of agri-food system and agri-food value chains. I think it is important for us to think if we wanted to create another overarching center group that remains stuck in HQ and high in the sky, or something that is more concrete and more efficient. And since our interest is, of course, to do the second thing and not to let, I was very moved by your example, Moana, on how we, I mean, the disconnection between the reality and what we are doing sometimes. We think that the Center of Excellence has to be, or has to say strongly, we strongly encourage to prioritize three aspects. Bring it to the field. So to make sure that what we are doing doesn't sit in the HQs, but is actually connected to the field. Organizing the information that exists. There is a lot of information there. We need to harmonize data collection, data analysis, tools, approaches. Sometimes we do exactly the same thing with different labels, and we know this. And then the third point is to make sure that we create a lot of data-driven evidence on the impact evaluation of what we actually do. And then we make sure that what we learn from the field can become, something that we can use for future actions. With this, we thank you. We are very happy to be part of this. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Marco. So we've been getting some questions in coming from everyone, and I'm going to mention a couple, but we'll start with one of them, back to the panel. At this point, as we raise these questions, it's really a bit more interactive between the panel on the types of things that they would like to ask and do. So if you do have a question, please feed it into the Slido. And as we think about this, one of the things that comes up is a critical question that we're hearing right now. Scaling up is always a problem. As I like to tell people, we have a lot of pilots and not enough planes, right? We have a lot of pilots on what we ought to do. The question is, how do we scale up? How do we make a regional effort? How do we coordinate better across our partners? What does it mean to scale up and still maintain a connection to the lowest level? So what I'd suggest is if you just put up your hand, I'll point to you if you want to make a quick response to that question. How do we move beyond the case studies? So there we go. We'll go to you now.
Thank you. So it's, everybody is worried about the scaling up question, right? Like you look into a landscape of projects that is very fragmented, and partly that fragmentation is driven by the different financing sources. But I think there's something to be said about collaboration between different institutions that basically have access also to different types of evidence, different financing streams, and we need to basically bundle these different projects into more integrated resilience programs. Now, it cannot be that you have one project delivering cook stoves here, another one planting trees there, another one doing insurance for a yet different group. Because on the one side, you're only addressing always one aspect of people's vulnerability, either the natural capital or the financial capital or the access to information or the access to technology, but you need to do everything at the same time. So these things need to come together, and I think the only solution is to work across agencies, across institutions, which then bring together different parts of a segmented financial architecture. That, to me, is probably the recipe for scaling up, and I think the UN country teams are probably a very good entry point, because this is where all the UN agencies sit together, and we, of course, need to consider the reality that the UN is not the only actor in these spaces, and that, there are Red Cross, there are international financial institutions and others. So basically building these bridges is, to me, very important.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you very much. Saber?
Yeah, just to add to what has just been said, I think, yes, of course, you need to consult as extensively as possible with especially the local communities. When we talk about the latest in technology, it's not the latest chip from Silicon Valley, it's what communities have known over the years. So I think when you're looking at scaling up, government ownership, country ownership is very important. Because many NGOs, I think, have many bright ideas. They have seed funding to do a concept, to prove the concept. And unless you have the government taking over the ownership, it is not going to sustain. So that, I think, is a very important part of the equation. And can I just quickly respond to some of the comments that came up?
Yeah,
I think, we have talked about coordination and better coordination across the UN system. When we talk about loss and damage, which has been brought up here, this is now going to be a big agenda item in the next COP. I was involved in the discussions in Glasgow. So loss and damage in terms of technical capacity, trying to quantify it, what are the areas, I think it's very important. So I hope that this Center of Excellence is going to coordinate with the UNFCCC, which is very important. And then, there are global centers for adaptation around the world. So that will also prevent duplication also at the development partner level. Thank you.
Excellent points. And we do need, as we're uncovering public-private partnerships, civil society, what constitutes legitimacy in data and information. You just heard quite a bit about, so we do need to think about that. Tiziana or Moana, any quick comments? Let's go Moana and then Tiziana in the order of the speakers.
Very short. From a government perspective, I think knowing exactly what you want and not trying to entertain or please the stakeholders, here in this case, perhaps the donors. Thank you.
Very good, very direct. Tiziana.
No, maybe just add in a couple of points. As you said, scaling up is the key question that we're all trying to answer, and we see so many pilots everywhere. But maybe two ways to look at it: one from more sort of a policy angle, and the other one from a more practical angle. I would say from a policy angle, there has to be much more alignment between the different agendas: climate, development, humanitarian, at an international, regional, and national level, so that indeed at a domestic level you can reach this horizontal integration that we need to have to support then the actions in a much more integrated way. From a practical point of view, and maybe this is also in connection to what has just been said, it's about truly connecting the key actors at local level and national level. And we have many experiences of our national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies who are developing very successful pilots, and then how do we take that to scale? And then it's a question of, for instance, in our case, to leverage their auxiliary role vis-a-vis the authorities, put them in contact with the right partners in the country, and taking those beautiful pilots to a different level. But it does require, indeed, identify what are the successful examples that can truly be used for scaling at a national and local level. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Tiziana. I agree on the successful examples. I also agree on learning from the failures, as you know. So in that context, as we think through the vertical and the horizontal, what needs to be coordinated? The actors. Yes, we know we need to do that. We're looking at a panel here of people who try to do this. So I'm going to come back to them after another question as we begin to wrap up and ask the question, if we know so much, how can we do better? In other words, who is to do it? What's the nature of the people that we need, a cadre of professionals? So as we think through this, in the context of global issues, whether it's ecosystem degradation, but right now, in the context of food crises, a question we have from the audience is, what actions can be taken now to address the looming global food crisis? And the question is framed in a really critical way, which is, are we concerned that we're not heeding the early signs of impending famine or any other such catastrophes or disasters? So this is a really critical question about a sense of foresight and how foresight becomes action at all. So who would like to take that up? And we'll start from Gernot. Thank you.
So the looming food crisis, no, is not something that's going to happen in 10 years. Right. It's here. I mean, it really feels like the world is coming apart at the seams. And you know, this was not something that you couldn't see. You know, we thought actually that the climate crisis would drive a lot of this in a more gradual way, but you can now see that the economic shocks that can come from a war ripple through a globalized system and then show everybody that our food systems and our energy systems are much too concentrated. No? So this is also something that at the local level, you know, applies. I mean, a diversified system is a more resilient system. And when you have a globalized system where, you know, we are only farming, you know, and using for staple crops, even though there are hundreds of those, you know, then eventually we're in a very vulnerable state. So that now comes on top of our problems on climate, and then the displacement crisis happens as well, no? So that drives social tensions and conflicts. So I think the confluence of these factors is new. And, you know, COVID, the shocks on inflation, you couldn't really see them coming very well. So there are certain surprises in the international systems that impact larger than we've seen them coming. But I'm afraid what this will mean is that now governments all over the world, they see that the world is very uncertain, and they try to reserve part of their national budgets for these, you know, uncertainties, rather than now investing them in the systems they need to manage risks that will be, you know, rising in the future. So we're seeing this a little bit in the shrinking aid budgets right now, the shrinking humanitarian aid budgets, you know, in proportion to the needs available. So, you know, we know what we need to do. The good news is also that the solutions exist. You know, every time I get frustrated, you know, I think we know what to do. It's about the institutional incentives. It's about basically things like Mr. Chowdhury has said, you know, reforming national policy systems so that you have one budget line for comprehensive risk management, you know, that gets you from risk analysis to anticipatory action, insurance, everything in one package. So, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the food systems are in a very difficult state, and it will not, to my mind, this will not become better anytime soon.
Yeah. Now, I appreciate your point about it not looming, but it's here. And in that context, I will ask Moana if you can add something from the context of, you know, the present situation versus how we're thinking, and then I'll come back to any of the other comments. So
thank you, Roger. When COVID pandemic emerged, back in my country, the church leaders, the community leaders, they encourage our villages, our communities this is the perfect timing for them to utilize and mobilize their current capacities, and that is like farming. So when the eruption came, of course, perhaps the very minor percentage of people living under poverty line, that was just perhaps the people that were needed the food. In my organization, we coordinate all the responses and all the emergency activities in our country. And after like a couple of weeks, of course, we have to distribute the food that were needed and the food that we have in our prepositioning in our warehouse. But after a month, a lot of the donors, a lot of the countries still say that they're sending us food. My boss and I were having a hard time because we don't have the capacity for storage. Not only just storage, but to distribute and disseminate those resources, it's not in our mandate. We don't have that. From our context, I think we've already done some sort of, intervention, encouraging. We have in the past, prior to emergency, during peacetime, that's what we do. We establish community emergency management committees where we facilitate them in, to how to respond or perhaps lead an evacuation should there be need. We run evacuation center management and, all these. So I'm not, I think I'm not the qualified person to answer this question, but I hope I contribute.
Very
Thank
helpful.
you.
Absolutely. Any quick comments or responses? Tiziana and then Saber.
Maybe just a complementary point, and again, I'm not the food expert here, but I think we also need to prepare for increasing movements of people. This is just, it's already happening, and the fact that people will be impacted directly in their livelihoods, so no access to resources, and what is happening globally would just increase the reasons why people will just have to leave, and we have to prepare for that. Right. And yes, there's still a lot of political sensitivities. I was actually myself last week in New York for the International Migration Review Forum, and we're still not there in terms of really acknowledging that these movements of people are not just caused by normal social and economic hardship, but there are so many much more serious reasons why people now and in the coming years will try to find hope somewhere else, and we have to prepare for that.
Very good. Thank you, Tatiana. Saber, a quick comment, please.
Yeah, very quick comments. First, I think, it's unfortunate that we need a crisis to wake up when it comes to resilience. But I'm afraid that's what's happening here also. We were talking about resilient health systems earlier, and now we are talking about a resilient food system. We'll talk about resilience when it comes to water. So these are continuous processes. And I think one is the importance of resilience, and the other is global solidarity. Right. The last thing you want is to have, as you had with COVID, vaccine nationalism. You don't want to have food nationalism, and countries holding on to whatever reserves they have. And even if you have the reserve, at what price are you able to sell it? Because that's where the affordability aspect comes in. So I think it's multidimensional. Absolutely. And just stresses the importance of international cooperation and solidarity. Thank you.
It's a really rich point about the alignment and the insight needed at the global level. And so coming back to the Center of Excellence, these are really critical points, because the Center does not address all of those, answer those questions, but helps facilitate the answers to those questions at a more rapid scale. And as we think through this, and we begin to wrap up here from all the insights we've had and the questions that we've come in, there are questions about, is the Center just another layer? There are questions about the Center as a boundary organization. There are questions about Santiago, and there are questions about the linking ourselves to foreseeing crises. But a crisis, as we know from theater, is a turning point. It's not something that stymies us. It is, do we choose to take, which path do we choose to take from a crisis? So from that standpoint, and as we wrap up here, I'd like to just give each of the speakers a minute to address the question. We talked about scaling up, we're talking about planning ahead, the investments needed for proactive approaches, and the role for doing this in fragile and highly vulnerable context. But you are individuals who represent a cadre of professionals that we need. We always ask the question, this is so complex, who is to do it? And from that standpoint, any insights you can help provide us on how we guide and inform and train a new group of people, or build on the ones we have to enhance not just structural risk, but our capabilities for responding, would be very much welcome. This includes engaging Indigenous peoples, women, and so on. So it's a tough question to answer, because I'm asking, how do you make it happen? So from that standpoint, I'm going to ask Gernot first, and then come down the line for just 1 minute. What is the gap on getting this done?
To my mind, the gap is to get the financing to the people who are in vulnerable conditions, and to do that ASAP. And so, as a humanitarian organizations, we're concerned about the next dry spell, which is a different timeline than when we normally talk about adaptation, or the longer-term impacts of climate change. For us, this is a very, very real issue. So if we are successful in this Center of Excellence, I think we will have made a contribution to direct financing flows to countries and to people who are already in very vulnerable settings, because this is our collective problem. The climate crisis, the money that's available for climate action is not going to people on the front lines. And so we need to make sure that disaster risk reduction, resilience building, climate action is prioritized for people who are already now, 1 foot before the abyss. That's for us the metric of success of our engagement in the center.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Tiziana?
Maybe an answer that is not very much humanitarian based. I would say, in my view, what we really need is political will. We have all the tools.
How do we get it?
We have all the methodologies. We know what, the resources, absolutely. But you also need political will. When you still have context where it is, sorry to say, sexier and more economically attractive to build an airport or whatever somewhere and destroy mangroves. I don't know where we're going, honestly. Or when you have a city mayor who's trying to say, okay, I need to address the upcoming volcanic eruption and I need to build a new water system because I know that otherwise my city will be deprived by water, but it's not happening now. I have many other issues to deal with. We need that level of leadership and political will to truly prepare for what is going to come.
Absolutely agree. And one of the issues is, how do we get it? And so from that standpoint, I think this is where individuals come in and leadership at every level.
Continuing to talk about it and advocate.
Right? The advocacy is a key part of the center. And this is going to be a rich notion. We're taking that seriously. Usually you stand back and say, I'm an independent scientist. Well, that doesn't work anymore. So next, Saber?
Very quickly, I think vulnerabilities are on the increase and rise. So because you've got limited resources, you need to prioritize. How do you prioritize? Which is the one that comes first? And then do the sequence properly. Which should be the one which is coming second and third? We can't address all of them overnight. And when you have a context of limited resources, how do you then sequence your interventions? I think that's going to be critical. The other would be following on from my earlier point. I think you're going to be flooded with requests and expectations. So I think maybe go also on a regional approach, have regional centers of excellence. So you have a global one which oversees, and then you have a regional, and then you task that with responsibilities to build capacities of individual countries. Maybe that would be an approach that you might consider. Thank you.
You're definitely not going to get an argument from me on strengthening the regional capabilities as the leveraging and coordination for different countries. So, Moana, our last and final.
Thank you, Roger. I think from a Tonga perspective, testing and really ensuring the interoperability of our systems being put in place. A lot of time we tend to say lessons learned, lessons learned. I, for once, do not believe in lessons learned because when disaster happens, we still fall into the same cap. We still do the same similar mistakes. So I think if we identify the best practices and see how we can move things forward. I'm happy also, Roger, to say that myself and my colleague were happy to share our recovery plan towards the Hongatonga-Hongapai eruption and the resulting tsunami. So feel free to approach us at the end of this session. We're happy to share with you. Thank you.
Moana, you ended on precisely the note I was hoping would be on, which is how we continue engagement. There were a lot of questions in the audience. I know people didn't use the Slido, but there's an opportunity for engagement after this in trying to get at these questions. And to your key point as we wrap up here, how does learning become action? This is actually a key part of the center. What does it mean to learn if we do not use that lesson? And so from that standpoint, we can point to a lot of diagnosis. But we're challenging and holding our own feet to the fire on turning that into knowledge and action using the best available data. So for those interested in discussing the future details, we have a few people in the audience that you can follow up with. And I want to thank them for the opportunities for engaging here. There's an old saying, right? The world is made up of particles, and scientists study that. But humans are made of their stories, and we're interested in hearing your stories and your cases and how we think through this. So Laurie Hébert-Giraudet, Adam Fish, Cyril Honoré, Erica Alice are some of the resource people we have who are actually shaping the center and are open to your knowledge. The leadership and vision of Ricardo, Johan, Mami, Mitsutori, and Petteri is something we appreciate because this is an effort not to do business as usual. So we're looking to you to link these visions and become those people and not just criticize. I'm guilty of this myself. Risk is about places and vulnerable people, but it is also knowledge coming from those people. And the effort of the center is to link those two scales. So thank you very much, and please follow up as you need with our group. Thank you.